On a misty morning in 1878, Kansas' four brothers returned from war carrying a secret so terrifying that even science refused to touch it. And by the next sunrise, the town itself would never feel safe again. The dawn broke over the Kansas plains in 1878 with a gray, somber light, a light that seemed to weigh down everything it touched. Mist clung stubbornly to the fields, curling around the skeletal fences and the weathered wooden homes, giving the entire town an air of hushed anticipation, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The McAllister house stood at the edge of the town like a sentinel, its paint faded to dull streaks of white, its windows reflecting the pale light in a way that made them look like vacant eyes staring at the world. Rumors had been circulating for weeks about the four McAllister brothers returning from the Civil War, but nothing could have prepared the townspeople for the aura of unease that seemed to accompany them. When the first distant sounds of hooves struck against the dirt road, those who caught sight of the approaching family carriages felt an inexplicable chill creep down their spines. "Bob, Bob!" Edward, the eldest, sat rigidly at the front of the carriage, his posture unnaturally stiff. His eyes, dark and hollow, scanned the horizon with an intensity that made even the seasoned drivers of the wagons glance away uncomfortably. Beside him, Samuel's hands never left the folds of his coat, knuckles white as if gripping some unseen terror. Thomas, the third brother, was quiet, almost invisible, but his gaze darted from side to side, tracking the movements of every passing figure, every fluttering bird, as if he could sense things beyond the perception of ordinary humans. And then there was Henry, the youngest, whose normally innocent face bore an expression far too old for his years, a look that spoke of knowledge, of horrors glimpsed but never shared. Together they seemed less like returning sons and more like spectral figures emerging from some other, darker reality. As the carriages rolled up the cracked wooden planks of the McAllister porch, a sudden gust of wind swept through the town, rattling shutters and sending leaves swirling across the street in chaotic patterns. Neighbors froze mid-step, hands gripping the tools they'd been carrying, eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and instinctive fear. Dogs, normally boisterous and playful, whimpered and huddled near their owners' legs, ears flat against their heads. Children playing in the dusty streets suddenly stopped, mid-laugh, mid-step, as if the air itself had demanded their silence. And for reasons no one could articulate, even the wind seemed to avoid the McAllister property, swirling around it in hesitant circles before retreating, leaving an unnatural stillness that clung to the air like cobwebs. The brothers did not speak as they stepped down from the carriages. Their boots made no sound against the wooden boards, though the house creaked beneath their weight. Edward's hand brushed briefly over the railing, but it was a mechanical movement, devoid of warmth, and those who observed it instinctively took a step back. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, voices low as if speaking too loudly might summon something they did not understand. "They've changed," one woman murmured. "The war, it's taken more than just their youth." Another man nodded grimly, tugging his coat tighter around his shoulders. "There's something in their eyes, something unnatural." Inside the house, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The mother of the brothers, a stern woman who had endured the harshness of life and the weight of raising four sons alone during the war years, stood at the doorway, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to mask her unease. She had heard stories of men changed by battle, men haunted by things that would break ordinary minds, but her sons carried an unfamiliar aura. Something in them was wrong. The air itself seemed to tighten around their presence, and even her own heart recoiled from the invisible force that radiated from the boys. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to step aside and let them pass, though each movement of theirs felt like a quiet assertion of power over the very house she had ruled for decades. The first night in the McAllister house was the one the town would remember for years, even if no one could describe it in detail. The wind howled outside, slamming against the sides of the house with an almost animalistic ferocity, but the brothers remained unmoved. Their footsteps echoed in the halls, yet it was as though no sound had been made at all. Lights flickered in patterns that could not be explained by faulty candles or drafts, and shadows clung to corners in ways that seemed deliberate, forming shapes that vanished the moment anyone looked directly at them. In the small town, windows of neighboring homes rattled, and some townsfolk awoke to find strange footprints in the dust outside their burr. Doors, prints that began normally but then twisted and elongated in ways that defied logic. Edward, the eldest, spent hours in the parlor, staring at a blank wall as if it contained some secret only he could see. He muttered to himself in fragmented sentences, words that made no sense to anyone listening but carried a tone of urgency and fear. Samuel wandered the halls and then the barns at night, leaving the family's livestock agitated and disoriented. Thomas and Henry were rarely seen together, yet their silent communication was palpable. Sometimes neighbors caught glimpses of them in the windows, their eyes reflecting an unnatural intelligence, an understanding of the world that no one else possessed. The air in the house felt thicker in their presence, like the very molecules were charged with something unseen, something that humankind had not yet learned to measure or comprehend. Outside, the town began to murmur of shadows that moved without owners, of whispers that seemed to ride the wind and curl into ears when no one was speaking. Children who had laughed freely in the fields now avoided the road to the McAllister house. Farmers spoke in hushed tones at the market, debating whether the brothers brought a curse back with them from the war, or if they had discovered some secret so terrible that even science dared not approach it. Letters sent by curious investigators returned with nothing but cryptic phrases, scrawled in handwriting that no human hand could imitate. Baw, baw. Instruments broke inexplicably, thermometers shattered, scales tipped into the impossible, and clocks ran backward for fleeting, terrifying moments. Those who tried to observe or measure the brothers' behavior left exhausted and unnerved, some muttering about a presence that seemed to resist documentation, that laughed silently at the very concept of logic. Even the mother, who had witnessed many horrors in her life, found herself unable to enter the boys' shared room without a deep, gnawing dread settling in her chest. The air there felt heavy, oppressive, and alive. She spoke their names softly, hoping for a response, but only silence answered her. When she looked closely, she could swear she saw the shadows twist in subtle, impossible ways. Objects seemed slightly displaced from where she remembered leaving them. It was as if the house itself had acknowledged the presence of the boys, bending reality subtly to accommodate them. For the first time in her life, she felt powerless, a sensation that terrified her more than any physical threat ever could. Outside the town, the plains stretched endlessly, but even the natural world seemed to recoil from the McAllister home. Birds avoided the area, their songs ceasing abruptly when the brothers were near. Wolves and coyotes howled in the distance, but never approached the house, as if aware that some other force ruled the land there. And at night, when the wind carried the mist low across the fields, townsfolk claimed to see FLBR, brah, ickering lights in the windows of the house that did not match the flicker of any candle. Some swore they could hear distant footsteps pacing in rhythm with an invisible clock, while others reported whispers calling their names, whispering truths too terrible to speak aloud. By the end of the first week, the McAllister brothers had become more than just a curiosity. They were a living mystery, a presence that challenged the very understanding of the townspeople. Children refused to pass by the house on their way to school. Adults avoided the road at night, crossing to the other side if they must. Even the bravest men of the town would quicken their pace past the MC Allister property, a tight knot of fear coiling in their stomachs. It was not merely the aura of grief and loss from the war that unsettled them. It was something older, something primal, a hint of a force that should not exist in the known world. A presence that science had not yet catalogued and perhaps never would. First night concluded with an eerie calm that seemed almost deliberate. The mist lifted slowly with the approaching sun, but a sense of foreboding lingered in every shadow, every cracked board of the porch, every whisper of the wind. The McAllister brothers had returned, changed, and in their return they had brought with them something the world was not prepared to see. And as townsfolk whispered to one another in fear and fascination, no one could have predicted that this was only the beginning of a story that would haunt Kansas for decades, a tale of fear, mystery, and a darkness that defied understanding. Even now, years later, if one stands at the edge of the McAllister property, at dawn, watching the mist curl across the fields, there is an uncanny feeling that the house remembers, that the brothers are not truly gone, that somewhere within the shadows, four pairs of eyes watch quietly, knowing secrets that no living soul should know. Secrets that science refuses to study, secrets that invite a fear deeper than the night itself. Almost as soon as the McAllister brothers settled into their family home, strange and unexplainable occurrences began to ripple through the town. At first, the whispers were subtle, barely audible over the clatter of daily life. A tool left in a barn one day would vanish, only to reappear in a completely different spot the next morning. Livestock would be discovered in impossible positions, standing awkwardly in the middle of fields where no fence or fence break existed. Chickens roosted on rooftops that had never supported their weight before, and horses stampeded in patterns that no one could explain. The townspeople began to murmur that these were not mere coincidences. Something about the McAllister brothers had awakened forces that defied reason. Those who attempted to investigate, even the most rational of men, would leave pale, shivering, their eyes haunted by visions they could not describe. Ard, the eldest, seemed to be at the center of these disturbances. He would sit for hours in the parlor, staring at walls with an intensity that felt almost physical, muttering strange equations and phrases under his breath. The words were fragmented, often nonsensical, yet there was a rhythm to them, a cadence that seemed to interact with the environment around him. Candles flickered and dimmed as he spoke, glass would rattle on shelves, and sometimes objects would move subtly, shifting just enough to catch the eye. No one dared approach him during these episodes, not even his mother. When she tried, she would recoil as if burned by the air itself, her skin prickling, her heart hammering in terror. She whispered prayers under her breath, but it was unclear if they were for her sons or for herself, for protection from whatever had followed them home. Samuel, the second brother, was quieter, but no less unnerving. He spent long nights wandering the barns and fields, often returning with dirt-stained hands and hollow, haunted eyes. Animals would follow him at times, inexplicably calm in his presence, yet at other moments they would panic without warning, scattering in all directions as if sensing something invisible. Farmers reported that their cattle were restless on nights Samuel ventured outside. Hogs would screech, sheep would bolt, and even dogs, normally loyal and brave, would whimper, hiding in corners as if aware that their master had brought something with him from beyond. Samuel's movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. He seemed attuned to energies that no one could perceive, reading currents in the wind, subtle vibrations in the earth, and unseen waves of power that seemed to emanate from the McAllister household itself. Thomas and Henry, the younger two, were perhaps even more unsettling. Thomas rarely spoke, yet his eyes followed people in ways that made them feel as though he could see through to their very thoughts. Children who ventured too close would run away screaming, claiming he whispered their names in voices that were not his own. Sometimes, shadows would gather around him unnaturally, clinging to his silhouette and stretching in impossible directions. Henry, on the other hand, seemed to commune with the unseen world. He scribbled in journals filled with symbols and equations that no one could read, yet the younger children in town swore they could hear soft chanting coming from the McAllister house at night, rhythmic and haunting, calling to something unseen. Those who pressed too close to the windows reported feeling icy fingers trace their spines, a sense of dread so deep that it left them unable to speak for hours. Townsfolk began to notice patterns in the disturbances. Events happened on nights when the moon was hidden or when mist settled heavily over the plains. Animals behaved oddly, crops failed in strange geometric patterns, and strange lights were seen flickering behind closed windows. Entire fields of corn seemed to twist in impossible diary-brations overnight. Nothing could explain the phenomena. Tools would vanish only to reappear days later in impossible locations. Livestock disappeared and re-emerged miles away, unhurt yet traumatized. Even the most rational and educated men of the town were forced to confront the impossible. Instruments of measurement, scales, compasses, thermometers, failed when near the McAllister home, readings fluctuating wildly or breaking entirely. Attempts to document the brothers' behavior ended in frustration or terror, as if the very laws of nature resisted observation. Octors and scholars were called from neighboring towns, summoned by the desperate townsfolk. They arrived with journals, instruments, and an air of confident rationality, certain that logic would prevail. Yet every one of them returned shaken, pale, and unable to explain what they had witnessed. One physician reported seeing Edward raise his hand, pointing toward a wall, and then watching in disbelief as the wall itself seemed to ripple, as if the wood had become liquid. Samuel was observed walking into a pen of pigs, which scattered in confusion, yet moments later the pigs returned and arranged themselves in perfect unnatural rows, following no discernible pattern of behavior. Thomas was seen staring into a mirror, and when the scholar peered over his shoulder, the reflection did not mimic their movement. Henry, meanwhile, was muttering numbers aloud, and when the physician tried to write them down, the ink ran "Twee-ba-ba" stead and formed symbols that were indecipherable, as though the house itself rejected their attempts to make sense of it. Word spread that the McAllister brothers were no longer men but conduits for something older, something ancient and unseen. Rumors grew faster than wheat in the spring. Some claimed that the brothers had brought back an occult knowledge from the war, forbidden knowledge that defied human comprehension. Others whispered darker things, that the war had not merely scarred them, but had opened doors to places no living person should have entered. Parents began warning their children to stay away, and even hardened farmers avoided passing the house after dark. Those brave enough to attempt it reported feeling invisible hands brushing against them, hearing whispers in languages that made their minds twist in pain. The air seemed heavier near the house, charged with a presence that resisted analysis and defied logic. Then the natural world appeared to respond to the brothers' presence. Birds avoided the trees near the house entirely. Wolves, coyotes, and other predators seemed to halt their movements when the brothers walked by, observing from a distance as though acknowledging that this land had become their domain. Winds carried whispers and soft humming, and the mist that often blanketed the plains seemed drawn to the McAllister property, curling in slow, deliberate patterns around the house like invisible guardians. The town's clockmaker reported that every time he attempted to measure time, his instrument stopped or ran backward. Every observer felt, if only briefly, that the universe itself was bending to accommodate the brothers' presence. At home, the mother could no longer enter the rooms without a gnawing dread settling deep into her chest. Doors that had once been ordinary seemed to pulse slightly, responding to movement she could not see. The family's pets refused to enter certain areas of the house, and when she attempted to investigate, she felt a presence behind her that was not her son's. One night, she swore she heard whispers calling her name, soft and melodic yet imbued with a sense of threat that left her trembling for hours. She began locking doors at night and praying in low tones, but she knew instinctively that no prayer could alter the forces that now walked among her sons. The brothers themselves appeared unbothered by the chaos around them. Edward's muttering became more complex, forming patterns and sequences that hinted at knowledge that humans were not meant to possess. Samuel continued his nocturnal wanderings, and townspeople began leaving offerings along the edges of the fields, tokens of appeasement, though no one could say what they were meant to appease. Thomas experimented with light and shadow, casting shapes that moved independently, creating images of creatures that had no place in the natural world. And Henry's mutterings and sketches became the most disturbing of all, forming a lang, huge and mathematics that seemed to alter reality itself. Those who tried to observe him directly would collapse in fear, describing visions of impossible geometries, walls bending, and rooms that extended far beyond the house's physical boundaries. The town's fear became palpable, a living thing that pressed down on every person. Markets were quieter, children no longer played near the McAllister property, and men carried rifles more often than plows. At night, Even those who slept near their hearths would wake to the sensation of eyes watching them, shadows flickering in the corner of vision, and the soft, melodic hum that seemed to come from the McAllister home. Attempts to capture the events in writing or sketching ended in frustration. Notes would vanish, drawings would distort, and instruments would shatter without cause. The town slowly realized that this was not a force that could be studied, trapped, or understood. It simply was, and in the presence of the brothers, reality bent, twisted, and warped beyond comprehension. And the church could offer no solace. Ministers visiting the McAllister house claimed they felt an oppressive darkness that weighed down their prayers. Candles burned with a sickly green flame, and shadows moved contrary to light. Some reported hearing faint chanting emanating from the walls themselves, voices that whispered in syllables unknown to any human tongue. The brothers, meanwhile, continued their silent experiments, seemingly unaffected by the fear and awe they inspired. It was as if they existed partially outside the world, observers and participants of a reality that the rest of humanity was only beginning to glimpse. And so the town became trapped in a slow, terrifying dance with the McAllister brothers. Curiosity battled with fear, fascination with dread. The brothers' lives continued, private and enigmatic, yet their presence was felt in every corner of the town. People spoke in hushed tones, telling stories of objects moving, livestock disappearing, and lights flickering in the dead of night. Each tale seemed more unbelievable than the last, yet the consistency of these stories made them impossible to ignore. Attempts to leave or intervene seemed pointless. The town had become part of the brothers' domain, a landscape over which they wielded a quiet and terrifying influence. By the end of the first month, it was clear that something in the McAllister household had broken free from explanation. Science, reason, and logic recoiled at the events unfolding. Instruments could not measure it. Observers could not catalogue it. Even the strongest minds of the era had been humbled, reduced to trembling witnesses of a force they could not name, a curse that was neither fully natural nor fully supernatural, yet which left an indelible mark on every person who came near it. And so the town learned, slowly and painfully, that the four brothers had returned with more than the scars of war. They had returned as the CBR bar, enter of a mystery that would haunt Kansas for generations, a shadow that science refused to study, and a curse that no one dared challenge. The air in the town grew heavier with each passing day. It was no longer just the McAllister house that seemed haunted, but the very streets and fields surrounding it. A pall of unease settled over the town, seeping into the minds and hearts of every resident. Farmers noticed their crops twisting unnaturally, bending toward the McAllister home as if drawn by an unseen force. Horses and cattle refused to graze near certain fields, and dogs whimpered in corners, eyes fixed on something invisible. Children, who had once run freely through the streets, now avoided certain houses and alleys, speaking in hushed tones of the eyes in the shadows that followed them when they dared to stray too close to the McAllister property. Even the sunlight felt muted here, as though the town itself had been drained of warmth and vitality. Tea. Townspeople began to speak of a presence, a force that could not be explained, that seemed to watch and judge from beyond the veil of ordinary perception. At night, the streets would grow eerily silent. Lanterns flickered and dimmed without cause. Footsteps echoed when no one was there, and soft whispers slithered through the wind, carrying fragments of words that made no sense but prickled the skin with fear. People swore they could feel cold fingers brushing their arms, fleeting touches that vanished the moment they but turned to look. The more they tried to rationalize it, the more the dread seemed to tighten around their chests, suffocating and unrelenting. The McAllister brothers had become more than neighbors. They were a looming presence, a shadow cast over every home, every street, every waking thought. The market, conversations slowed to whispers. Men avoided eye contact, fearing to draw the attention of forces they could not see. Women huddled together, exchanging stories of strange lights in the distance, or voices calling their names in the dead of night. Livestock traders reported that animals became skittish and unmanageable near the McAllister farm. Horses bolted without warning, pigs would vanish from their pens only to return days later in a state of terror, and dogs would bark frantically at empty spaces. No one could explain it, and the very notion of explanation seemed to wither in their minds. Those who attempted to confront the phenomena, even in simple curiosity, often ended the day pale, trembling and muttering about shapes that moved against logic and shadows that didn't belong. Townspeople took to walking the streets with lamps held high, as if illumination alone could stave off the oppressive force that hung over the town. They spoke of fleeting glimpses, a flicker of a dark figure in a window, a silhouette that seemed too tall, too angular to be human, or eyes glinting in places where eyes should not exist. These sightings were brief, almost teasing, yet to plant seeds of fear that would grow unchecked. At night, no one dared venture beyond the central streets. Every alley, every empty field, every path leading toward the McAllister house felt alive with a presence that should not exist. Shadows twisted in impossible directions, and the faintest sounds were magnified into something terrifying. A single whisper could make a grown man stumble backward, his pulse hammering in his ears, his body trembling under an invisible weight. Town's children were the first to be truly affected. They spoke of dreams that seemed to bleed into reality. One child described a room that stretched endlessly, walls lined with moving faces whispering secrets no one could understand. Another claimed the McAllister brothers appeared at the foot of his bed, silent and imposing, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, and that he had woken to find marks in the dirt outside his window, footprints that ended abruptly as if the ground itself had swallowed them. These tales were dismissed at first, but when more children spoke of similar experiences, fear spread like wildfire. Parents found themselves torn between comforting their children and protecting themselves from the growing dread that the stories implied. An invisible threat, ever-present and impossible to confront, and the adults were not immune. Farmers working late into the evening reported feeling watched, followed, or drawn toward the McAllister property without realizing it. Men who considered themselves rational and brave found themselves frozen, staring at empty fields where the wind shifted in unnatural patterns. Women awake in the night heard low humming, melodic and insistent, that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some claimed that the sound called to them, pulling their attention with a force they could not resist. Those who approached the source, some daring, some foolish, would return shaken, pale and unable to articulate what they had seen, only that it defied understanding. Even animals reflected the growing tension. Horses refused to enter certain pastures, cows would huddle in corners as if anticipating some unseen threat, and dogs growled at empty spaces, their fur standing on end. The local wildlife seemed altered, reacting not just to the physical presence of the brothers, but to something intangible radiating from the McAllister property. Birds avoided the trees surrounding the house entirely, and wolves and coyotes kept their distance, circling the property in anxious, hesitant patterns. It was as if the natural world itself recognized that these brothers were not bound by ordinary law, and that some darker force had taken root among them. Town's own leaders were forced to acknowledge the strangeness. The sheriff, a man who had faced countless threats in his time, admitted privately to friends that he felt powerless when near the McAllister house. Reports of strange lights, sudden chills, and impossible occupants left him wary of nighttime patrols. Church elders attempted to bless the property, reading scripture aloud as they walked its perimeter, but even their voices seemed swallowed by an invisible presence. Candles burned low and flickered, shadows danced independently of their light, and a low humming vibration ran through the air, felt more than heard. Their attempts to bring order failed, leaving only a growing sense of futility. At night, the town became a place of whispered fear. Families bolted doors and windows, yet the wind and mist carried stories, whispers, and sometimes the faintest flicker of impossible lights. Some claimed they could see shapes moving behind curtains, and the sound of footsteps pacing within the McAllister home echoed faintly through the streets. Those brave, or foolish, enough to investigate reported visions of fleeting figures, tall and angular, moving in ways that defied physics. Children spoke of glowing eyes, murmured secrets, and shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally, sometimes disappearing entirely when approached. The line between dream and reality blurred, leaving the townsfolk exhausted, paranoid, and constantly fearful. Rumors grew into legends. The brothers were said to communicate with forces beyond comprehension, to bend the laws of the natural world with thought alone. They were believed to have powers that science could not measure, the ability to move objects without touch, to manipulate animals and the weather, and PBR, perhaps even to influence the minds of the living. Every whisper added weight to the mythos surrounding them, and with each passing day, fear became self-reinforcing. The town itself felt transformed. Once bustling streets slowed, markets quieted, and the energy of life seemed drained. It was as if the presence of the McAllister brothers had altered the very fabric of the town, creating a space where fear and uncertainty reigned supreme. Then those who tried to rationalize the occurrences began to feel the creeping dread. Scholars and scientists brought instruments to study the brothers' behaviors, but left frustrated and terrified. Compasses spun wildly, thermometers fluctuated, and recording devices failed inexplicably. Nothing could capture the full extent of the phenomena. Some claimed that the brothers were conducting experiments with forces unknown to mankind, unlocking secrets that should have remained hidden. Others whispered that they were merely the vessels for something older, something that had chosen the McAllister family as its conduit into the human world. Children, terrified and fascinated, would sometimes gather in secret to share stories. They described visions of forests bending unnaturally, rivers that seemed to flow uphill, and stars that moved in patterns that did not belong in the night sky. These stories, dismissed at first by adults, began to take on a terrifying consistency. It became clear that the brothers' presence had changed the town in ways that were subtle yet irreversible. The land itself seemed to resonate with their presence, responding in patterns that defied understanding, and the air itself carried a tension that could be felt in every breath. Even the simple act of walking near the McAllister property became a test of courage. Residents described a sensation of being drawn toward the house, as if invisible threads tugged at their very bodies. Shadows seemed to reach for them, curling around their legs and climbing along walls. Sounds became distorted, the creak of a board, the howl of the wind, each amplified into something terrifying. People began to avoid roads that passed near the house, taking longer, more convoluted paths just to remain at a safe distance. But no matter how careful, the sense of dread lingered, seeping into the town's consciousness like an unshakable fog. He, most courageous or foolish, occasionally tried to confront the source of the fear directly, peering through windows or walking into the McAllister yard under the cover of darkness. What they reported varied, but all left them pale and trembling. Some swore they had seen the brothers standing in impossible positions, eyes glowing faintly in the shadows, murmuring words that twisted the air itself. Others claimed objects would shift in response to their presence, doors closing on their own, candles extinguishing without wind. A few spoke of fleeting glimpses of creatures, neither fully human nor animal, darting in the periphery of vision, always retreating when attention focused directly on them. By the time the town reached the end of that first year after the brothers' return, fear had become a constant, unspoken companion. No one dared speak openly about what had transpired. The McAllister house became a forbidden zone, the fields around it abandoned, the paths avoided. Children told tales of shadows and glowing eyes at night. Families locked their doors earlier and earlier, and even those who tried to live normally felt the weight of dread pressing down on every thought. The brothers had transformed the town into a place suspended between reality and nightmare, and the residents were powerless to resist the pull of the darkness that now clung to the land. Inside the McAllister house, the air was thick with a tension that seemed almost alive. It clung to every corner, every piece of furniture, every crack in the wooden floors, making the very walls feel oppressive. Those who dared to approach the house spoke of a heaviness in the air, a suffocating weight that pressed down on their chests. But inside, among the brothers, it was not just heavy, it was charged, electric, as if the house itself had become a vessel for something ancient, something that had chosen this family as its guardian. Edward, the eldest, moved through the parlor with a deliberate precision, his eyes scanning the room as though he could see layers of reality invisible to anyone else. His hands traced imaginary patterns in the air, Leven Barbar, trails of energy that seemed to ripple and shimmer before fading. Candles flickered as he passed, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, bending in ways that defied geometry. Edward's notebooks were a labyrinth of cryptic symbols, diagrams, and formulas that twisted logic itself. When townsfolk or visiting scholars attempted to decipher them, they reported a sensation of vertigo, a feeling that the room was tilting and stretching in impossible ways. One visitor claimed that the ink on Edward's pages seemed to move subtly when he wasn't looking, curling into shapes and then reforming into something else entirely. Another swore that staring too long at the diagrams caused visions of impossible architectures, cities that twisted skyward in spirals, landscapes that folded upon themselves, and figures that moved through walls as if matter was nothing more than suggestion. It was as if Edward had unlocked a vision of the world beyond, a place where the rules of the natural order were meaningless, and yet he moved among it as though it were entirely familiar. Samuel, the second brother, spent long hours in the barn and the surrounding woods, collecting specimens that no ordinary person could explain. Plants seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, their veins glimmering like threads of silver. Stones hummed softly when held, vibrating in ways that defied known physics. Animals behaved unnaturally under his gaze, moving in patterns that hinted at intelligence beyond company. Memprehension. Samuel would return from these excursions with his hands dirt-streaked and eyes wide, muttering to himself in a language that sounded like a cross between arithmetic and song. Those who glimpsed him working claimed to see a strange interaction between him and his environment, as if he could coax life itself into revealing its hidden patterns. Yet despite the strangeness, there was a sense of meticulous order in his actions, a deliberate method to what outsiders could only perceive as madness. Thomas, quiet and observant, spent hours in front of mirrors that covered the walls of his room. At first it seemed like an ordinary fascination, a boy playing with reflections, but closer observation revealed something far stranger. Thomas appeared to watch the mirrors with an intensity that suggested he saw beyond mere reflections. Shadows within the glass would stretch and twist independently of the room, and sometimes figures appeared where none existed, fleeting images of places that could not possibly exist in the physical world. The mirror did not merely reflect. It revealed, it expanded, it opened doors into dimensions that humans were never meant to observe. At times, Thomas would step back from the glass, scribble frantic notes, and then return as if following instructions whispered by the images themselves. It was said that the mirrors whispered to him at night, guiding his hands and thoughts, teaching him patterns that no ordinary mind could comprehend. Henry, the youngest, was perhaps the most unsettling of all. He scribbled in journals with a fevered intensity, creating symbols, equations, and charts that seemed to twist reality itself. Visitors who tried to read his notes would find the letters shifting before their eyes, forming new patterns that were incomprehensible, as though the very act of observation triggered changes in the text. Henry spoke in low, melodic tones, often to himself, sometimes addressing something unseen, something that responded in kind. It was as if the walls themselves listened, vibrating faintly in response to his words. The youngest brother had a way of making the impossible seem plausible, of presenting a reality that existed just out of reach of ordinary perception. Those who spent time in the room with him reported a sensation of vertigo, a feeling that the boundaries between floors, walls, and ceiling had dissolved, leaving them suspended in a space that was part house, part dream, part nightmare. The mother of the brothers attempted to enter their rooms from time to time, drawn by both fear and a mother's curiosity, yet each time she retreated in terror. The air in the rooms was heavy, charged with a presence that seemed almost sentient. Objects would shift subtly when she entered, shadows would stretch to touch her, and at times she swore she heard voices calling from the walls. On one occasion she claimed to see a chair rise from the floor, slowly tilting toward her before collapsing back into place. She would pray, whispering scripture under her breath, yet even her prayers seemed to bend and warp, losing their potency in the charged atmosphere. The house had become an extension of the brothers, a space molded by forces that could not be measured, observed, or understood. Visitors who dared to enter reported a growing sense of unease from the moment they crossed the threshold. Scholars brought journals and instruments, certain that logic and reason would allow them to unravel the mystery. Yet every attempt failed. Compasses spun wildly, thermometers fluctuated without pattern, and writing instruments failed mid-sentence, leaving indecipherable marks. One scholar described a sensation of being watched from every corner simultaneously, of shadows crawling along the walls, stretching and twisting to meet him wherever he turned. Another claimed to hear faint chanting emanating from behind doors that led nowhere, a rhythmic hum that seemed to move in sync with the beating of his own heart. Every observer left pale, trembling, and unsure whether what they had seen was real or the product of a fraying mind. Even the house itself seemed to respond to the brothers' presence. Floors groaned under invisible weight, doors creaked though no one approached, and lights flickered without cause. Candles would burn with uneven flames, casting shadows that danced independently of the objects around them. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the mother claimed to hear the sound of footsteps pacing across the hall above her, though every room had been checked and remained empty. It was as though the house had become a living entity, aware of the brothers' actions, amplifying their influence and resisting intrusion from outsiders. Those who lived nearby spoke of a strange resonance in the air, a vibrating hum that seemed to pulse with a rhythm only the brothers could feel. The brothers' experiments, if they could even be called that, went beyond the natural world. Edward seemed to bend light and shadow, creating shapes that defied Euclidean geometry, figures that appeared three-dimensional in the air and then vanished entirely. Samuel's specimens often defied classification: plants that moved slowly, stones that hummed, and animals that responded with unerring precision to his gestures. Thomas's mirrors reflected not just rooms but entire landscapes, visions of forests, mountains, and cities that could not exist in Kansas. Henry's calculations seemed to predict the movement of objects and living beings in ways that no mortal mind could comprehend. Together, the brothers were conducting a symphony of the impossible, each contributing their own unique, terrifying talent to a larger, unknowable design. Neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of these activities through the windows, but the details were fleeting and confusing. Shadows moved independently of the brothers, shapes shifted when no one was in the room, and faint, inexplicable lights danced along the walls. Those who watched too long would experience dizziness, nausea, and a gnawing sense of unease that lingered long after they had returned home. It was impossible to discern the boundaries between the physical world and whatever layer of reality the brothers had tapped into. Attempts to approach were met with an almost palpable resistance, a feeling that the very air conspired to push intruders away. Animals within the house were also affected. Cats would hiss at empty corners, dogs would refuse to enter certain rooms, and birds brought into the house became agitated, fluttering frantically until released. Even the furniture seemed responsive, rocking slightly when the brothers passed or shifting in subtle ways that suggested intentional movement. The house, the brothers, and the objects within had become a single organism, an interconnected web of influence that extended far beyond the comprehension of anyone living outside its walls. The mother, though fearful, could not fully abandon her sons. She kept watch from a distance, observing them with a mixture of horror, fascination, and sorrow. Each night she would pray, begging for protection from the unknown forces that seemed to radiate from her children, yet each day she returned to witness them continue their work, undeterred by the fear they inspired. It was a strange balance, love and terror, devotion and dread, all intertwined in a delicate, unbreakable tension. Despite the chaos and danger within the house, The brothers themselves appeared calm, almost serene, as if completely in tune with the forces they commanded. Edward moved with purpose, Samuel with intent, Thomas with concentration, and Henry with an almost childlike intensity. Together, they conducted experiments that defied all understanding, uncovering patterns, connections, and phenomena that ordinary minds could not comprehend. Their work was meticulous, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise, a combination that left any observer awestruck and horrified in equal measure. It became increasingly clear that the McAllister house was more than a home. It was a laboratory, a stage, and a sanctuary for forces that should not exist. The brothers were no longer simply men. They were conduits, vessels for knowledge and power that defied understanding. Every whisper of the wind, flicker of shadow, and ripple in the air seemed to respond to them, bending to their will in subtle and terrifying ways. The house, the land around it, and the very atmosphere of the town had been altered, reshaped into a reflection of the brothers' presence, a testament to the unseen forces they commanded. So, behind closed doors, the McAllister brothers continued their work, isolated from the world, yet inseparably entwined with it. Their experiments, incomprehensible to ordinary humans, radiated outward, touching the town, the fields, and the people in ways subtle, insidious, and irrevocable. Science refused to acknowledge what was happening, logic failed to contain it, and reason stumbled helplessly against the walls of a reality that had been stretched, twisted, and expanded by the hands of the four brothers. The secrets behind closed doors remained hidden, terrifying and endlessly compelling, a mystery that promised that nothing in Kansas, or perhaps in the world, would ever be the same again. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, yet the McAllister brothers continued their private experiments behind closed doors. The town had grown used to the oppressive tension, the subtle, unrelenting feeling that something was watching, shaping, bending the air around them. But there came a morning when the town awoke to a quiet that was deeper than fear, heavier than expectation. The McAllister house, which had always loomed at the edge of the town like a silent sentinel, seemed to have been emptied of life. Windows were open to the dawn, letting in the cool mist that rolled across the fields, yet there was no sign of movement. No shadows, no whispers. The air, once thick with tension, felt hollow, as though the very presence of the brothers had lifted, leaving only echoes of the dread they carried. Those who dared approach the house noticed immediately that something was different. The furniture remained exactly where it had always been, the floors unscathed, and the doors locked from the inside in the manner the brothers would have left them. Yet despite this apparent normalcy, the house emitted a strange energy, a residual hum that made skin crawl and hearts pound. Footprints that had once marked the paths of the brothers through the fields were gone, erased completely from the earth as if they had never existed. Livestock that had been restless now wandered aimlessly, as if confused by the sudden absence of the force that had guided their behavior. Even the wind seemed cautious, moving slowly, as if it, too, felt the absence of something that had once commanded the elements around the McAllister property. Sheriff, who had long avoided the house at night, ventured cautiously to the front door. He found it unlocked, and as he stepped inside he was struck by the unnatural silence. It was a silence so complete that it seemed to press against his eardrums, a vacuum where every small sound, his own breath, the shuffle of boots across the floor, echoed loudly and unnervingly. The house smelled faintly of herbs and strange chemicals, a scent that was both familiar and alien, clinging to the air like a memory. The sheriff's lantern illuminated the rooms, revealing notebooks stacked neatly, mirrors standing undisturbed, and faint chalk marks on the floor forming patterns. NBR. One could interpret. Yet the most disturbing fact was the emptiness. The brothers were nowhere to be found, not a trace, not a shadow, not a single clue to their whereabouts. Neighbors gathered cautiously outside, drawn by the same curiosity and fear that had defined their lives for months. Children whispered to one another, speaking of visions they had experienced in the nights past. Lights in the windows, figures in the mist, shadows that moved independently of the brothers themselves. Now, seeing the house empty, many felt a surge of relief, tempered immediately by an unease that no one could name. The absence of the brothers did not ease the tension, it intensified it. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath, uncertain of the implications of their disappearance. Scholars and scientists, who had previously abandoned all attempts to study the McAllister brothers, returned in cautious waves. They arrived with journals, instruments, and theories, hoping that the sudden emptiness would finally allow for observation and understanding. Yet their efforts were in vain. Compasses spun uncontrollably, thermometers fluctuated wildly, and instruments of measurement malfunctioned, as if the house itself refused to be studied. Notes were left behind in hopes of recording phenomena, only to find that ink would smear or fade, diagrams would shift subtly, and equations would rearrange themselves into forms that were incomprehensible. It was as though the house, even empty of the brothers, retained the essence of their influence, protecting secrets that science could not access. The townspeople, too, noticed that the world outside the McAllister property had changed. Roads that had once been safe now seemed lined with shadows that moved of their own accord. Mist rolled differently across the fields, curling and coiling as though following unseen currents. Animals, once influenced by the brothers' presence, now appeared restless in a new way, agitated by forces invisible yet perceptible. Even the weather seemed to hold a grudging acknowledgement of the brothers' absence. Winds carried a faint hum, clouds shifted unnaturally, and the sun's light fell strangely across the fields, casting shadows that seemed to bend and twist in defiance of natural laws. The town had become a place suspended between the normal and the impossible, a liminal space shaped by the echoes of the McAllister brothers' power. Mores began to swirl about what had become of the brothers. Some claimed they had vanished into thin air, transcending the limits of the human world to inhabit realms beyond comprehension. Others whispered that they had merged with the house itself, becoming part of the very fabric of the property, shadows and whispers that moved unseen through walls, floors, and ceilings. A few believed that the brothers had discovered a gateway, a hidden passage to dimensions where the laws of reality were fluid and mutable, and that they had stepped through leaving the town behind to grapple with the remnants of their influence. All of these stories were passed in hushed tones, often with a mixture of fear and awe, and each account seemed more unbelievable than the last. Those who entered the house after the disappearance reported strange phenomena that persisted long after the brothers were gone. Mirrors reflected images that were not in the room. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and soft murmurs, almost melodic in nature, echoed through empty corridors. Some claimed to feel the gaze of invisible eyes upon them, a weight that pressed upon their chest and made every step cautious and deliberate. Objects sometimes shifted subtly, moving just enough to catch attention without explanation. The house was alive with the echoes of the brothers' presence, a ghostly monument to their work, their knowledge, and their power. It was as though the McAllister family had left not simply a home, but a residual force, a mark on the world that could never be erased. Town itself became a place of superstition and caution. Parents warned children to avoid the house entirely, even in daylight, and neighbors crossed streets or changed paths to keep as far away as possible. Some spoke of glimpsing figures in the windows, fleeting shadows that darted just out of reach of vision. Others claimed that at night, soft lights danced behind the curtains, flickering as though in silent ritual. Even the bravest adults felt an unease that was difficult to articulate, a sense that the world had been altered by the brothers' presence, and that they themselves were living in a place now governed by forces beyond comprehension. Efforts to understand the disappearance through science or reason yielded nothing. Journals, notebooks, and instruments had been left behind, but they were unusable. Symbols shifted when observed, patterns warped, and instruments seemed to operate under rules that were no longer consistent with the natural world. Attempts to follow traces of the brothers into the surrounding fields, forests, or plains were equally futile. Footprints disappeared into nothingness, soil seemed to erase any mark they had left, and animals avoided paths that might have indicated movement. Even the wind, the air itself, seemed to conspire in their concealment. Those who ventured too close sometimes reported seeing fleeting figures just at the edge of perception, always retreating, always evading, always teasing the limits of understanding. As years passed, the town's memory of the McAllister brothers became legend, a story whispered to children on stormy nights. Every year, the anniversary of their disappearance brought an uneasy quiet, a sense of waiting, of something that might return or might still be watching. Travelers passing by the abandoned house reported sudden chills, hearing whispers carried on the wind or glimpsing lights flickering behind dusty windows. Scholars occasionally attempted to record phenomena, only to leave with pale faces and trembling hands, their notebooks filled with scribbles they could not comprehend. The house, and perhaps the brothers themselves, had become a nexus of the inexplicable, a location where reason faltered and the mind struggled to grasp what reality had become. Some townsfolk came to believe that the brothers had not truly vanished. Edward, Samuel, Thomas, and Henry were said to exist in the spaces between worlds, glimpsed only by those sensitive to forces unseen. They were imagined to move through shadows, whisper to the wind, and bend reality from beyond the confines of human perception. Others thought the brothers had transcended mortality altogether, becoming eternal observers of the human realm, guiding, watching, and influencing events in ways no one could measure. And still others maintained that they had discovered a secret so profound that the mere act of comprehension could drive a person mad, a truth that humanity was not meant to encounter. Despite the passage of time, the McAllister house remained a place of fear and fascination. Children dared each other to approach the fence, feeling a pull toward the structure that was at once terrifying and irresistible. Animals avoided it instinctively, sensing what humans could not name. Travelers who passed by spoke in hushed tones of strange reflections in the windows, odd hums carried on the wind, and shadows that lingered long after the sun had set. Every person who had lived through the brothers' presence carried the memory of them, an imprint of something powerful, unknowable, and unnerving. Even decades later, historians and researchers who stumbled upon the story found themselves unable to unravel it. Notes from the brothers, if found, would defy interpretation, symbols and diagrams shifting in ways that could not be explained. Witness accounts, though detailed and consistent in some respects, lacked tangible proof, leaving only the haunting certainty that something extraordinary, terrifying, and beyond comprehension had occurred. The town itself had been transformed by their presence, shaped into a place suspended between the ordinary and the impossible, and the legacy of the McAllister brothers endured in whispers, shadows, and the lingering hum of the unexplained baba. The ultimate vanishing of the McAllister brothers remained one of the most enduring mysteries of the 19th century. They were never seen again, yet their influence persisted, haunting the town, the fields, and the minds of those who had witnessed even the smallest fraction of their work. Science refused to study them, logic could not contain them, and reason had been humbled in their wake. And so the story of the McAllister brothers concluded not with answers, but with a quiet, suffocating truth, that some forces are beyond comprehension, some mysteries cannot be solved, and some presences, once awakened, leave marks on the world that never fade, shadows that linger, and a dread that refuses to be denied.